England in 1066 did not fall in a single afternoon. People imagine it that way, a battle, an arrow, a king dead on a hilltop, and then conquest. Clean, swift, and total, like a door slamming shut. But that is not what happened. What happened was slower, uglier, more human, and far more devastating than any single battle could ever be. The England that existed on the morning of October 14th, 1066, was a prosperous, ancient, sophisticated kingdom. It had laws, it had a currency, it had towns, trade routes, monasteries filled with books, and a system of governance that was, by the standards of medieval Europe, remarkably advanced. By the end of William's reign, that England was gone. Not destroyed in a day, destroyed in pieces, village by village, family by family, field by field. A world dismantled so thoroughly that within 20 years there was almost no one left in power who spoke English. This is what that destruction looked and felt like, not from the perspective of kings and dukes, but from the ground, from the villages, from the houses where ordinary people woke up one morning in a country they recognized and went to sleep, months or years later, in one they did not. We are going to walk through that world step by step. First, we will see the England that existed before the Normans came, the country they broke. Then we will stand in the aftermath of the invasion and feel what it was like to live through the first months of occupation. Then we will go inside the homes, the fields, and the churches, and see how daily life changed, and how much of it did not change at all under the new order. And finally, we will stand in the shadow of the castles, the new forests, and the great survey that recorded every cow, every pig, and every acre of land in the conquered kingdom, and understand what it meant to be counted by a king who did not speak your language. To understand what the Normans destroyed, you have to understand what was there before them. The England of early October 1066 was not a primitive place. That is one of the great distortions of history. The idea that the Anglo-Saxons were backward, disorganized, living in some kind of pre-civilized fog that the Normans swept away with their superior culture. The opposite is closer to the truth. Anglo-Saxon England had a national tax system, the Geld, that could assess and collect revenue across the entire kingdom. It had a coinage that was controlled, regulated, and periodically recalled and reminted to prevent debasement. It had shires, each with a shire court and a sheriff. It had hundreds, each with its own assembly. It had a written legal tradition stretching back centuries. Its monasteries were centers of learning. Its metalwork was famous across Europe. Its embroidery, the needlework that English women produced, was so fine that it was known on the continent simply as opus Anglicanum, English work, as though no further description were needed. The towns were busy. London had perhaps 15,000 people. Winchester, the old royal capital, was thriving. York, in the north, was one of the great trading cities of the Viking world. Markets operated on fixed days. Merchants moved goods along Roman roads and river routes that had been in use for centuries. Wool, grain, leather, salt, iron, tin. The economy was not large by modern standards, but it was real, and it worked. The villages were the heart of the country. Thousands of small communities spread across a landscape of open fields, pasture, and woodland. Each village had its lord, a thegn, a minor nobleman who held land from the king and owed military service in return. Below the thegn, the ceorls, free farmers who worked their own strips in the open fields, paid their rents, attended the local court, and lived lives that were hard but not hopeless. Below the ceorls, the gebers and cotters, peasants with smaller holdings or none at all, who worked the lord's land in exchange for a plot, a house, and the right to exist. and below them the enslaved, perhaps 1 in 10 of the population, who had no rights, no land, and no freedom. It was not equal, it was not just, but it was stable, and it was theirs. The language was English, Old English, a Germanic tongue, rich, flexible, capable of poetry and law and prayer. The great poem Beowulf had been composed in this language. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year record of events stretching back to the Roman period, was written in it. Alfred the Great had translated Latin texts into it 2 centuries earlier because he believed his people deserved to read in their own tongue. This was the country that Harold Godwinson was defending when he marched his exhausted army south from Stamford Bridge and drew up his shield wall on a ridge near Hastings on the morning of October 14th. And this was the country that ceased to exist by nightfall. The Battle of Hastings lasted most of a day. By the standards of medieval warfare, it was long and bloody and desperately close. The English held their ridge. Their shield wall absorbed charge after charge. For hours, the outcome was uncertain. But by evening, Harold was dead. His brothers were dead. The core of the English aristocracy, the men who had governed the shires, led the armies and held the kingdom together, lay on that hillside, broken. William did not march on London immediately. He waited, he burned, he circled, he moved through Kent, through Surrey, through Berkshire, through Hertfordshire, leaving a trail of destruction that was deliberate and calculated. He was not just conquering territory, he was breaking the will to resist. And it worked. By Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was conducted in Latin and French. The English congregation outside, hearing shouts from within and not understanding what was happening, began to panic. The Norman guards, hearing the commotion, assumed a revolt had begun and set fire to the surrounding buildings. William was crowned in a burning city, surrounded by smoke and screaming. It was, in a way, the perfect symbol for everything that would follow. For the ordinary people of southern England, the first weeks after the conquest were a time of bewilderment. In the villages nearest to the line of William's march, the reality was immediate and brutal. Farms burned, livestock slaughtered or driven off, grain stores emptied. Families who had spent the autumn preparing for winter found themselves with nothing. But for villages farther from the path of the army, the change was slower and stranger. Life continued. The fields still needed tending, the animals still needed feeding, the bread still needed baking. The rhythms of daily survival do not pause for conquest. What changed first was the Lord. In village after village across the months and years that followed the conquest, the English then disappeared. Sometimes he was killed, sometimes he was dispossessed, his lands simply taken and given to a Norman. Sometimes he fled north or west or abroad, joining the English exile communities that gathered in Scotland, in Flanders, in Byzantium, where former Anglo-Saxon warriors served as the personal guard of the emperor. In his place came a stranger, a Norman lord. A man who spoke a language no one in the village understood, who had customs they had never seen, who ate differently, dressed differently, prayed in the same churches, but with different words in his mouth. The village did not change overnight. The houses were the same, the fields were the same, the church was the same. But the man who owned it all, the man who took the rents, who sat in judgment, who decided how much grain you kept and how much you surrendered, was no longer one of your own. He was a foreigner, and he did not care whether you understood him. For the peasants, the immediate change was not cultural, it was material. The Normans were not coming to England to learn English farming techniques, they were coming to extract wealth. And they were efficient at it. Rents increased, labour obligations expanded, the old arrangements, the customary agreements between lord and peasant that had evolved over generations understood by both sides, flexible in practice even if harsh in principle, were swept aside and replaced by new demands that the peasants had no power to negotiate and no language to challenge. The first winter under the Normans was cold, and for many people in southern England it was hungry, but it was nothing compared to what was coming. In the winter of 1069 to 1070, William did something that even his own contemporaries struggled to justify. The north of England had resisted. York had rebelled. Danish ships had arrived in the Humber, and for a moment it looked as though the conquest might unravel from the north. Edgar the Key, Atheling, the last male heir of the old English royal house, had joined the uprising. The north was burning with defiance. William's response was total. He marched his army north and over the course of the winter systematically destroyed everything. Not just the rebels, not just the fortifications, everything. Crops were burned in the fields. Grain stores were emptied and set alight. Livestock were slaughtered, not taken, slaughtered, so that nothing remained. Ploughs were broken, seed corn was scattered into the mud. Villages were razed to the ground. The people who did not flee, the old, the sick, the young, the slow, were left with nothing in the middle of winter. The chroniclers called it the harrying of the North. They described it in terms that still carry the weight of horror 900 years later. Orderic Vitalis, a chronicler who was half English and half Norman, wrote that more than 100,000 people perished. The number may be exaggerated. The reality was not. The Domesday Book, compiled 16 years later, recorded vast areas of Yorkshire, Lancashire and the surrounding counties as simply waste. Not poor, not underdeveloped, waste, empty, nothing there. People ate dogs, they ate horses, they ate rats. There are accounts, and these are from Norman sources, not English ones, of people selling themselves and their children into slavery in exchange for food. The roads south were filled with refugees, starving families walking through the winter, carrying nothing, heading anywhere that might have food. Many of them died on the road. Others reached the Midlands and the south, where they became beggars, dependents, or simply disappeared into the landscape of the conquered kingdom. This was not a battle. It was not a siege. It was a deliberate act of destruction aimed at an entire population. William did not want to defeat the North. He wanted to make sure the North could never resist again, and he succeeded. For a generation, the north of England was a wasteland. The villages that had stood for centuries were gone. The fields that had fed thousands lay fallow. The churches were empty. Their roofs burned, their priests scattered. The people who survived carried the memory for the rest of their lives, and they passed it to their children, who passed it to theirs. The harrying did not just destroy the North, it destroyed something inside the idea of resistance itself. After 1070, there were no more major rebellions in England. The English had learned what happened to those who defied the conqueror, and that lesson was taught not in a royal court or on a battlefield. It was taught in the ashes of a village, in the body of a child dead from starvation, in the silence of a valley where there had once been the sound of people living. If this kind of deep historical reconstruction is something you value, subscribing is the best way to make sure the next one happens. Every video takes weeks of research, writing, and production, and your subscription tells me that this work matters. If you have been watching this far, you already care about history done properly. That means a lot. Now, let us step inside the conquered world and see what daily life looked like under the new order. The sun still rose. The bread still needed baking. The animals still needed water. This is the thing about conquest that the history books often miss. The dramatic events, the battles, the burnings, the crownings are recorded because they are dramatic. But the life that continues underneath the drama is rarely written down because it is ordinary, and ordinary things do not interest chroniclers. But ordinary life is where most people lived. And in the England of the late 1060s and 1070s, ordinary life was a strange, disorienting mixture of continuity and rupture. The house was the same timber frame, the same wattle and daub walls, the same thatch overhead, dark with smoke, the same central hearth, the same packed earth floor, the same low benches along the walls where the family slept and ate and worked. The woman still rose before dawn to coax the fire back to life. The children still carried water from the well. The man still walked out to the fields in the grey morning light to check on the animals, to mend the fence, to begin the endless cycle of ploughing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting that had not changed in centuries. But outside the house, the world was different. The most visible change was the castle. The Anglo-Saxons had not built castles, they had fortified towns, the burhs that Alfred had begun and his successors had expanded. But the castle, the private fortress of an individual lord, designed not to protect a community but to dominate it, was a Norman invention, and it arrived in England with the speed of a plague. Within 10 years of the conquest, hundreds of castles had been built across England, not the great stone keeps that tourists visit today. Those came later. The first castles were motte-and-bailey constructions, a mound of earth, sometimes natural, sometimes heaped up by forced labour, with a wooden tower on top and a fenced enclosure at the base. They were crude, they were ugly, and they were terrifyingly effective. A motte-and-bailey castle could be built in weeks. It required no special materials, just earth, timber, and labour. And labour was something the Normans had in abundance, because they could simply order the local population to dig. The peasants who built these castles were building their own prisons. They knew it. They dug the ditches and raised the mounds with their own hands, under the supervision of men who did not speak their language, knowing that the tower being raised above them would be used to control them, to watch them, to punish them if they resisted. The castle changed the landscape and the psychology of every community within sight of it. In Anglo-Saxon England, the lord lived among his people, in a hall, yes, a larger and finer building than theirs, but a hall nonetheless, open and accessible. The Norman lord lived above his people, literally, on a mound, behind a palisade, in a tower, visible but unreachable. The message was clear without being spoken. You are below, I am above, and the distance between us is measured in earth and timber and armed men. The food had not changed, not yet. The same crops grew in the same fields, barley, oats, rye, some wheat in the better soils of the south. The same vegetables filled the pottage pot, onions, leeks, cabbages, beans, peas, turnips. The same animals provided milk, wool, eggs, and meat. The pig was still the most common source of flesh for an ordinary family. The chicken still scratched in the yard. The cow was still too valuable to slaughter lightly. Bread was still the foundation of every meal, dark, heavy, gritty bread, ground on the quern, baked in the communal oven or on a flat stone by the hearth. Ale was still the daily drink, brewed at home, weak and sour, safer than water from the stream. What changed was not what people ate, but how much they kept. Under the Anglo-Saxon system, a peasant owed a certain portion of his harvest to the lord, a certain number of days of labour on the lord's land, and a certain payment in kind: eggs at Easter, a pig at Michaelmas, a measure of honey at midsummer. These obligations were customary. Everyone knew what they were. They had been the same, more or less, for generations. The Normans did not respect custom, they did not know it, and they did not care to learn it. What they understood was extraction. How much can this village produce? How much can I take? The new lords assessed their lands with a cold, systematic eye. They counted the ploughs, they counted the livestock, they measured the woodland, and they set new rents, new labour services, new obligations that were, almost without exception, heavier than what had come before. A family that had kept enough grain to feed itself through winter now found that the surplus was thinner. The margin between survival and hunger, always narrow, became narrower still, and there was no one to appeal to. The old courts still met, the hundreds still assembled, but the language of power had changed. The lord spoke French, his steward spoke French. The documents, the writs, the charters, the records were increasingly written in Latin or French. An English peasant standing in his own village court, trying to assert a customary right that his grandfather had exercised, found that the words he used carried no weight. The law had not changed on paper, but the people who enforced it had, and that made all the difference. Clothing in conquered England remained what it had been for generations. The raw materials had not changed. The skills had not changed. The looms still stood against the walls of village houses. The drop spindles still twisted wool into thread in the hands of women who had learned the motion from their mothers, who had learned it from theirs. Men still wore the long woolen tunic, belted at the waist, with trousers wrapped at the calf. Women still wore the linen undergown beneath a heavier woolen outer dress, cloaks against the cold, leather shoes that let in the water, a hood, a cap, a headcloth. The colours were still the colours of undyed wool, cream, grey, brown, the dark tones of moorland sheep. Dyed fabric existed, blues from woad, yellows from weld, reds from madder, but for the ordinary villager, colour was a luxury. What the Normans brought was visible only at the top. The new lords and their households dressed in finer wool, in brighter colours, in styles that were subtly different, shorter tunics, different cloaks, different cuts. The differences were small, but in a world where everyone in a village knew exactly what everyone else wore, they were unmistakable. You could see the conquest in the clothes of the man who owned you. The church was the one institution that should have been a bridge between the old world and the new. Both the English and the Normans were Christian. Both attended Mass. Both revered the saints, observed the fasts, and believed in the same God. But William understood that the church was power, and he treated it accordingly. Within a few years of the conquest, almost every English bishop and abbot had been removed and replaced by a Norman. Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was deposed. Wulfstan of Worcester was one of the very few English bishops allowed to remain, and even he was pressured. The new bishops and abbots were not necessarily bad men. Some were reformers. Some were scholars. Some genuinely believed they were improving a church that had grown lax. But they were foreign, and they brought foreign ways. The services were still in Latin. That had not changed. But the sermons, the informal words of comfort, the language in which a priest spoke to a grieving mother or a dying man, that had been English. Now, increasingly, it was not. The new priests sent from Normandy did not speak the language of the people they served. For a peasant, the church was not just a place of worship. It was the centre of community life. It was where you were baptized, married, and buried. It was where you heard the only news that came from beyond the village. It was where you confessed your sins and received what little reassurance the medieval world could offer. That God was watching, that suffering had meaning, that death was not the end. To walk into that church and find a stranger at the altar, speaking words you could not understand, dressed in vestments you did not recognize, was not a small thing. It was a rupture in the most intimate relationship most people had, their relationship with God, mediated through the only institution they trusted. The bells still rang, the candles still burned, the cross still stood above the door, but something essential had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Of all the changes the Normans brought, none was felt more bitterly by ordinary people than the forest laws. William loved hunting. The Normans loved hunting. It was not a pastime. It was a statement of power, a ritual of dominance, and a symbol of everything the new order represented. The king owned the deer. The king owned the boar. The king owned the forest itself. And in Norman law, the forest was not what you imagine when you hear the word. It was not simply woodland. A royal forest was a legal designation, an area of land which could include fields, villages, pasture, and heath as well as trees, that was placed under a separate set of laws designed to protect the king's right to hunt. William created the new forest in Hampshire. The chroniclers said he destroyed dozens of villages to do it. He removed the people, levelled the houses, and turned productive farmland into a hunting ground. Whether the number of destroyed villages was exaggerated is debated. What is not debated is that people were displaced, that the land was taken, and that everyone in southern England knew it had happened. The forest laws were savage. If you killed a deer in the king's forest, you could be blinded. If you hunted without permission, you could lose a hand. If you were caught with a bow in the forest, you were assumed to be a poacher. The penalties were designed not for justice, but for terror. For the peasants who lived near or within a royal forest, and the forests were vast, covering perhaps a third of England by the end of William's reign, the laws were a daily humiliation. You could not hunt. You could not clear land for farming. You could not cut timber without permission. You could not let your pigs forage freely, because pigs might disturb the undergrowth where the deer fed. The animals in the forest had more legal protection than the people who lived beside it. This was not an accident, it was a message. The land belongs to the king. The deer belong to the king. You belong to the king. And your right to exist on this land is a privilege that can be withdrawn at any moment. An English peasant who had, for his entire life, walked into the nearest woodland to gather firewood, to trap a rabbit, to let his pigs root among the oaks, now found that these ordinary, ancient, unremarkable activities were crimes. The forest did not move, the trees were the same, the paths were the same, but the law had changed, and the law had teeth. In 1085, William ordered something that had never been done before in medieval Europe. He sent his men across England, every shire, every hundred, every village, to record what was there. Who held the land, how much it was worth, how many ploughs it had, how many people lived on it, how many cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats it supported, how much woodland, how much pasture, how much meadow. What it had been worth in the time of King Edward, what it had been worth when the new lord received it, and what it was worth now. The result was the Domesday Book. The name itself tells you how the English felt about it. Domesday, the day of judgment, the day when everything is known and nothing can be hidden. The survey was conducted with a thoroughness that was, by medieval standards, extraordinary. Teams of commissioners travelled across the country, holding courts in every shire, summoning local juries of Englishmen and Frenchmen, questioning them under oath, cross-checking answers against each other, verifying the details. Nothing was too small to record. A mill, a fish pond, a beehive, the number of plough teams, the number of villagers, smallholders, and slaves. The survey counted everything because William wanted to know everything. He wanted to know exactly what his kingdom was worth down to the last acre and the last pig. For the ordinary people who were questioned, The village reeves, the local farmers, the men who had to stand before the commissioners and answer. The experience was both humiliating and terrifying. Humiliating because they were being catalogued, not as people, but as assets. The Domesday Book does not record names of peasants. It records numbers. How many villagers, how many boarders, how many slaves. They existed in the book not as individuals but as components of an estate's productive capacity. Terrifying, because the purpose was taxation. Everyone understood that. The king was not counting his people out of curiosity. He was counting them so he could tax them more efficiently. Every plough, every acre, every animal recorded in the Domesday Book was a line in a ledger that would determine what you owed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by English monks who had watched their world dismantle around them, recorded the survey with a bitterness that has not faded in 9 centuries. They wrote that it was a shame to record, but the king did not care about shame. He wanted to know what every man had and what it was worth, down to the last ox and the last cow and the last pig, and nothing was left out. The Domesday Book is one of the most remarkable documents in European history. It is also, if you read it from the perspective of the people it catalogued, one of the most chilling. It is a record of total knowledge in the service of total power. It tells you everything about every village in England except the one thing that mattered most to the people who lived in them, how they felt. The conquest created a fractured world, and nowhere was the fracture more visible than in language. The Normans spoke French, not the French of Paris, a dialect of their own, Norman French, shaped by their Scandinavian ancestors and their years in northern France. This was the language of the court, of the law, of the church hierarchy, of every institution that held power. English did not disappear. The peasants still spoke it. The village priest still used it. Children still learned it from their mothers. It was the language of the field, the hearth, the marketplace, and the home. But it was no longer the language of authority. An English-speaking peasant who needed to address his Norman lord needed an interpreter, if one could be found. A litigant in a manorial court spoke words that the judge did not understand. A monk who had spent his life copying manuscripts in Old English found that the new abbot wanted texts in Latin or French. The practical effect was silence. Not literal silence. People still spoke. But the English-speaking majority of the population was cut off from the mechanisms of power. They could not read the documents that governed their lives. They could not speak to the men who ruled them. They could not argue, petition, or plead in the language of the court. This linguistic divide lasted for centuries. It took nearly 300 years before English became, once again, the language of law and government. When it did return, it was changed beyond recognition, filled with French words, French structures, French sounds. The English language survived the conquest, but it did not survive unchanged. Every time a modern English speaker says beef instead of cow, pork instead of pig, justice instead of fairness, or court instead of yard, they are hearing the echo of this fracture. The animal in the field kept its English name, because the English peasant still tended it. The meat on the table took a French name because the Norman lord ate it. The conquest lives in the language. It has never fully left. If you lived in a village in England in the 1070s and 1080s, the fear was not the same as the Viking fear of earlier centuries. The Vikings came and went. They raided, they plundered, and they left, or they settled, and, over time, became neighbours. The Normans did not leave. They were not raiders. They were occupiers. They were permanent. The fear was not of a sudden attack. It was of a system that could take your land, increase your rent, demand your labour, punish you for hunting a rabbit, and record your existence in a book so that nothing you had could escape the attention of the king. It was a quieter fear than the terror of a Viking raid, but in some ways it was worse, because there was no hope that it would end. The Vikings might sail away. The Normans had built castles. They were staying. At night, in the villages, men still talked in low voices, but now the conversation was different. It was not about whether the raiders would come. It was about whether the new lord would raise the rents again, whether the forest warden would fine them for gathering wood, whether the labour service would be increased, whether the castle being built on the hill above the village would require another season of forced work. The women still spun wool by the fire, the children still slept on the benches, the dog still lay near the hearth. The sounds of the night were the same. The wind in the thatch, the occasional cry of an owl, the distant bark of a fox. But the world outside the door had changed, and everyone in the house knew it. There was a particular kind of grief in this, a grief for a world that had not been destroyed by nature or by God, but by men. Men who had crossed the sea, won a battle, and decided that everything you had was now theirs. The old Thegn was gone. The new lord did not know your name. The priest spoke words you could not follow. The law had become a foreign language. The forest that your father had walked in freely was now a place where you could be blinded for killing a deer. And yet, the fire still burned. The bread still rose. The children still grew. The conquest changed almost everything about who held power in England. Within 20 years, the entire landowning class had been replaced. The English Thegns were gone, dead, exiled, dispossessed. In their place stood Norman barons, Norman bishops, Norman abbots. The Domesday Book records fewer than a dozen English landowners of any significance remaining in the whole country. The church was Norman from the top down. The cathedrals that began rising in the decades after the conquest, massive, heavy, Romanesque structures of stone, were built in a style that was deliberately different from what had come before. Durham, Ely, Winchester, rebuilt. Canterbury, rebuilt. These buildings were not just places of worship, they were statements of dominance in stone. The castles reshaped the landscape and the mind. Where once the village had looked outward toward its fields, now it looked upward toward the tower on the hill. Where once the Lord had been a man you might speak to at the harvest feast, now the Lord was a figure behind walls, visible only when he rode through the village with armed men. And yet, and this is the part that matters most, the life underneath all of this continued. The fields were still ploughed by English hands, the bread was still baked by English women, the sheep were still sheared by English farmers, and the wool was still spun and woven on English looms. The language survived. The customs survived. The way that villages organized their fields, managed their commons, settled their disputes, and buried their dead. These things endured, because the Normans, for all their power, could not replace an entire population. They could replace the lords, they could replace the bishops, they could replace the language of the court and the law and the church, but they could not replace the people who actually did the work. And so England continued, conquered, humiliated, impoverished in many places, grieving in others, but alive. The woman at the quern still ground the grain, the farmer still mended his fence, the child still carried water from the well, the priest, even if he was now a stranger, still rang the bell on Sunday morning. The sun still set behind the same hills, and the stars that rose over the village were the same stars that had risen over it before the Normans came. The country had been taken, the people had not. To live in England under William the Conqueror was to live in a world that had been broken and was being rebuilt, but not for you. The castles were not built for your protection. The forests were not preserved for your use. The survey was not conducted for your benefit. The new churches, grand as they were not raised to comfort you. Everything the Normans built, they built for themselves. And the English, the farmers, the weavers, the shepherds, the blacksmiths, the mothers, the children, lived in the shadow of those buildings and adapted and endured and waited. They did not wait for liberation. There would be no liberator. There would be no moment when the Normans left and the old order returned. The change was permanent. The old England was gone, and it was never coming back. What came instead was something new, something that was neither purely English nor purely Norman, a hybrid, a fusion slow and painful and unwilling that would take centuries to complete. The language that emerged from this fusion, Middle English, then Modern English, carried both bloodlines. The legal system that emerged carried both traditions, the culture, the architecture, the food, the names, the very idea of what it meant to be English. All of it was shaped by the collision of 1066. The people who lived through that collision did not know this. The woman baking bread in a Wessex village in 1080 did not know that she was living through the birth of a new civilization. The farmer in Yorkshire, rebuilding his house on the ashes of the old one, did not know that his grandchildren's grandchildren would speak a language that blended his words with the words of his conqueror. They only knew the work in front of them, the fire that needed tending, the children that needed feeding, the rent that had to be paid to a lord whose name they could barely pronounce, and the knowledge, bitter, unspoken, carried in the body like a scar, that the world they had been born into was gone, and the world they now lived in was not theirs to shape. Under William, England was not yet English. It was something older and stranger, a conquered land, held together by force and fear, and the stubborn, unremarkable persistence of people who had no choice but to keep living. The castles still stand. The cathedrals still rise. The language still carries the wound, but the people who bore the weight of all of it, the people who baked the bread, who carried the water, who built the mounds on which the towers stood, their names were never recorded. They were counted in the Domesday Book, but they were not remembered. They should be. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this kind of deep historical reconstruction, please subscribe. I make videos that bring lost kingdoms, decisive moments, and great turning points back to life in a way that is simple, visual, and grounded in real history. And if there is another lost city, forgotten battle, or vanished world you want to see rebuilt, leave it in the comments. What should I reconstruct next?